And we are live. Hello, everybody. Good afternoon. Hello, Nina. How are you doing?
Hi, Marcelo. I'm a little bit sick, but I'm going to push through, so I apologize for my voice, although I am using a new microphone for any of you guys asking asking about that question. Welcome to another episode of the Winter Latina Show. Today we have a very knowledgeable guest for you guys. It is Dr. John Laughland, who is a British author. He's also a lecturer in politics, in history at the Catholic Institute of the Vendée in France. He is also the director of the Forum for Democracy, which is a political party in the Netherlands, in the European Parliament as well, and this is sort of its international branch. So John has been published extensively, both in major publications like The Guardian, The Wall Street Journal, as well as more niche publications like The American Conservative. So we're really excited to have him here today. Marcelo, let's bring him on, and let's have him correct me if I mispronounced anything, if I misintroduced anything.
Before bringing him on, I would ask you to reload your camera page, please. I don't know why it's completely blurred here for me and for everybody watching, probably.
Whose page?
Your
My
page? Yes, Nina. Always great, everybody. And yeah, I have Nina back, and it seems much better.
Seems much better. Okay. I'm using the highest internet connection possible, so hopefully it works.
Yeah, I don't think the ocean internet cables are doing very well today.
But we can talk about that too.
It's probably Putin's fault. So, okay, let's bring our guest. Hello, sir. Welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you, John. Thank you so much for participating. We have a lot of questions, but of course, I first would like to know whether I mispronounced, misintroduced anything,
everything was fine.
completely butchered my French.
It was fine.
Okay, so is there anything you'd like our listeners and our viewers to know before we jump into the questions? Maybe something that you're working on now, maybe particular highlights of what you've been working on previously?
Well, I've been working in my garden all day because I'm in the country at the moment, and I combine my normal intellectual work with shoveling gravel and cutting down trees and things like that. So I'm sort of half on holiday at the moment, but I'm very soon about to spring back into normal life. I'm giving a lecture for Forum for Democracy for the youth movement on Monday about LGBT as a instrument of American hegemony. That's a theme that I've lectured on before, and I lecture on all kinds of different subjects, but that's the latest thing that I'm working on right at the moment.
Yeah, this was actually one of my questions. I was looking at your articles on the Forum for Democracy webpage, and so this was going to be my question a little bit later on, but since you brought it up, I'm really curious. First of all, that there even is kind of a youth movement, or I don't know if this is like an activist branch of the movement that you would describe it as, but also that particular topic, which is obviously, you know, in the mainstream considered to be a bit of a taboo subject, especially presented through the paradigm of American hegemony. So if you can elaborate on this, that would be amazing.
Forum for Democracy is a political party in the Netherlands. I work for that party. I work for the parliamentary group in the Dutch Parliament. Unfortunately, we don't have a presence anymore in the European Parliament. That's one minor detail that I should correct. We did have a member of the European Parliament. In fact, we had 3, but for various reasons, we don't have any anymore. And but as you can tell, I'm not a Dutch national. I don't. I literally work as an advisor to the party. And yes, there is a youth wing. The party is in fact the largest party in the Netherlands in terms of members. It has 60,000 members, which is 50% more than the second largest party, so it's by far the biggest political party in terms of members. Unfortunately, it's not the biggest in terms of representation. It has 3 members of parliament in the lower house of the Dutch parliament and 2 in the Senate. So it has a fairly small representation at national level, but it has a huge presence in the country at large, in the media, of course, to some extent, particularly in the alternative media. And yes, there's a youth movement. There's a very active youth wing, if you like, and those are the people that I'm going to be seeing on Monday. They're coming down to France for a summer camp, and it's only a couple of hours' drive from where my country house is. So that's why I'm going to speak to them.
Okay, thank you for elaborating. This is a question we've actually brought up in literally our previous episode, where we discussed balancing ideas and intellectual work with activism, which one should take precedence, whether one is more important than the other, whether one should even exist. We were talking about activism specifically. So it's really interesting that the Forum for Democracy does have this youth wing, and it sounds from my research that this is a fairly new party. From what I understand, it was launched in 2016, and you're describing it as being quite popular without perhaps that actual tangible political representation. And the way the party has been described in the mainstream media is, sometimes using monikers like the far right. So I really would like you to actually clarify the founding of the party first and foremost, and of course its objective. Maybe its objectives about 10 years ago and when it was launched, and
it was
its
set
objectives
up in
today.
2016, originally as a think tank, but it then became a political party on the back of a substantial political victory which it scored in 2016, namely the organization and then the winning of a referendum on Ukraine's on the association agreement with Ukraine. The party leader and founder Thierry Baudet, who is an old friend of mine, decided to mount a campaign. The Dutch constitution allows citizens to mount. It used to allow citizens to mount a campaign for a referendum, and it mounted that referendum campaign successfully. The referendum took place, and Forum for Democracy, which campaigned against the association agreement with Ukraine, won by a substantial majority. But as is the way in the European Union, this has happened many times before, the European Union didn't take any notice of the fact that the Dutch electorate had voted against the association agreement. The Dutch government didn't take any notice either. And everyone said, well, too bad, you voted against it, but it's going to go ahead. And indeed, that's what happened. So faced with this very obvious assault against democracy, because this was an example of direct democracy, the Netherlands is obviously has a long democratic tradition. It doesn't have there are not many countries, as you know, which use referendums frequently. In fact, there's only one really, Switzerland. But the Netherlands does, or used to have referendums, a bit like Britain, a bit like France, but they're only used occasionally. And so on this rare occasion when it was used, the fact that the government said, no, we don't care how you vote, we're going to sign this anyway, was, of course, an affront to democracy. And Thierry Baudet then stood together with a colleague for election in the 2017 national elections. They won 2 seats, so Thierry has been a member of parliament since then. In 2019, they won the provincial elections. They were the biggest party in terms of electoral results. And in 2019, am I right? Yes, they also did very well in the European elections, with winning 3 seats in the European elections. But I think the point that probably interests you is this Ukraine issue. If I'm right, Nina, I think that interests you.
That's one of the questions. That you're sort of forecasting my questions. My question was going to be, why did they vote against the association agreement in 2016?
You asked me also about the moniker far right. So yes, the party is a conservative party. It's against mass immigration. It's against. It was against obviously the Ukraine. It's skeptical and hostile to the European Union. It favours the Netherlands leaving the European Union and so on. Thierry fought a brilliant campaign in 2021 in the Dutch national elections against COVID lockdowns, against COVID policy. He wrote a very good book, which is in English, which exists in English, called The COVID Conspiracy, published by Amsterdam Books, which is Thierry's own publishing house. So if your viewers are interested, the COVID Conspiracy, in which Thierry lays out things that we now know, but that he wrote the book, within a few months of the whole COVID. He originally wrote it in Dutch, of course, and then it was translated a year or so later into English. So those are the sort of big issues. And obviously, since the Ukraine war broke out in 2022, the party has been in the forefront of opposition to the. So it was a Eurosceptic party from the very beginning, and that was one of the reasons why they voted against the. They wanted to vote against the association agreement because they were generally sceptical and still are of the EU, as indeed I am, and I've played my own role in the question of Brexit. But of course, since the war started in February 2022, FVD has again been very much in the forefront of opposition to the Western policy on the war. So, for example, as soon as it broke out, Thierry made a number of statements saying that, he didn't buy into the narrative. He made one or two statements which were widely noticed at the time, basically in favor of Russia. When President Zelensky addressed the lower house of the Dutch Parliament by video link, as you remember, he did this. He started in the House of Commons, and then he popped up everywhere. When he addressed the Dutch Parliament, FVD refused to attend. They said, "We're not attending. Foreign leaders do not give addresses to our Parliament. We don't recognise this. We are the Dutch Parliament. Our role is to hold the Dutch government to account. It's not to listen to foreign leaders. We don't have any control over them, so why should we listen to them?" And so they were not there for that, which of course caused a huge, outrage at the time. And systematically, FVD has opposed the standard line, and we were the first, myself and the Thierry Baudet and the other two, because they're now down to two members of parliament, have been very active in questioning and in contesting the narrative on Ukraine, in particular, but not only, with respect to Nord Stream and the sabotage of the Nord Stream gas pipelines. And I mention that because we're today the 15th of August, and yesterday, as everybody knows, the German prosecutor announced that he was seeking an arrest warrant and an extradition for a Ukrainian national in Poland. And yesterday as well, the Wall Street Journal said that President Zelensky ordered this operation, which means that the Netherlands, Germany, France, I mention those countries because they're very often publicly held energy companies were shareholders in Nord Stream. The Dutch company Gasunie in Dutch, had a 9% share in Nord Stream. The French energy company Engie had a 9% share, and there were two big, giant German energy companies, one of them which belongs to BASF, which each had or have 15% share in Nord Stream. So these three countries were owners through Nord Stream of the pipeline and through their companies, which in the case of the Dutch company is a public company. So the country itself owned the pipeline, and the country was, of course, then the victim of this sabotage. And if the German prosecutor is correct, and if indeed it was carried out, and if the Wall Street Journal is correct that it was carried out under the orders of President Zelensky, then these countries, which were themselves victims of an attack on their critical infrastructure by Ukraine, these countries have been giving tens of billions of euros and signing 10-year military treaties with Ukraine, even though, as I say, according to the German prosecutor and the Wall Street Journal, this country attacked their critical infrastructure. And FED is the only party that called this one out. I myself did an article a few days after the pipelines were blown up. I said the Americans did it. I'm skeptical about the role of this Ukrainian diving instructor, but who knows? Anyway, one way or the other, our allies seem to have done it. And as I say, FVD is certainly the only party in the Netherlands, and it's one of the very few political parties in Western Europe to have made these statements. So we're out there on our own, or at least very nearly on our own.
Yeah, that's a really great point, because when people talk about the Nord Stream sabotage, they say that it was an attack on Russia, but Russia has done pretty well in terms of reorientating itself toward other markets. Obviously, this was very damaging, but exactly as you pointed out, I think it's a really good case can be made for the fact that the biggest losers and the biggest victims or targets were certain countries in Europe. I would include Germany on this list as well, of course. So then the question arises, why, regardless of who the culprit is, I'm also skeptical of, considering the specificity and the type of training that such an operation would require, I'm also skeptical of the people who've been announced as potential perpetrators. Nonetheless, regardless of who they are, why is this such a taboo subject when this was such a massive attack on as you said, European major European infrastructure for multiple countries? Why is it so taboo? Why is the Forum for Democracy, as in the Netherlands, the only party even mentioning this topic in this way?
Well, I'm going to say something which is considered to be deeply shocking in Germany. I don't live in Germany, so I'm not afraid of shocking anyone. But and I'm generally not afraid of shocking anyone. As far as Germany is concerned, I think that we can only conclude the silence. Okay, so the prosecutor has now made this announcement, but so perhaps I should revise. But I mean, the prosecutor is not the government. My opinion is that Germany is, and has been since 1945, an occupied country. And if you have huge American bases on your territory with tens or hundreds of thousands of soldiers, then you are not free. And we know that the German government was complicit in what I believe to be the American plan to blow up the pipeline, because Joe Biden said on the 7th of February 2022, we have a way to stop the pipeline, giving a knowing look to the German journalist who asked the question, how are you going to stop it? He said, we have our ways. And he was standing next to the German Chancellor, Olaf Scholz, who said nothing. So Scholz was complicit. He probably knew that the Americans were planning. I don't know whether he did or not, but one way or the other, he was complicit. And all the other countries involved, Denmark, Sweden, and so on, they are also, well, certainly in the case, not yet in the case of Sweden, I don't believe, but in the case of Finland, which is not directly involved in this Nord Stream issue, but these countries, as soon as they join NATO, which, as you know, Finland and Stockholm and Sweden did very recently, they immediately become hosts, if we can put it that way, to American bases. Finland now has 13 American bases with extraterritorial jurisdiction. Finland cannot prosecute the soldiers who are there. We in Britain have had experience of this. There was a very sad case a few years ago when a CIA, as it happens, CIA agent based in a military base in Britain took the wrong turning or drove on the wrong side of the road or something. As you know, in Britain we drive on the left. In America they drive on the right. And this woman killed a young motorcyclist. She was immediately exfiltrated to America and has never faced any kind of prosecution for dangerous driving. So we have a direct experience. It's a very minor detail, but it's a rather emblematic illustration of what extraterritoriality means. So these countries are complicit. They are controlled and they are complicit. I don't think there's any other reasonable conclusion. They surely know. Who did it, more or less. So now, as it happens, as I say, the German prosecutor seems to have launched this prosecution. Whether this is as they say in French, une fausse piste, a red herring, we say in English, to set people off on a separate scent. So whether it's an independent Ukrainian operation, independent of the Americans, which I absolutely don't believe, and therefore whether this prosecution is designed to exonerate the Americans, I don't know. But ultimately, as you've just said, Anina, it doesn't in a way sort of matter whether it's the Ukrainians or the Americans or both or one or the other, because both of them, of course, are on the same side in this war, and the European governments are on that side. And yet, as we see, those countries, the countries that owned the pipeline or jointly owned it, are of course victims, not to mention the economic fallout, which of course is massive.
So is this one of the reasons a party like Forum for Democracy is popular, but perhaps doesn't have that representation in, actual tangible politics? Is it because you are able to address questions that everyone is affected by, but there is a taboo around them? And by the sounds of it, at least the way I interpret your words, it sounds like some of these leaders in European governments or perhaps people in the European Parliament are working directly against the interests of their own people.
Well, of course they are, but the problem is that when you are the bearer of bad news, as FVD often is, then unfortunately that doesn't make you popular. I'm not going to pretend that it makes you popular. As I'm sure you know, modern politics is based on absolutely cretinous levels of emotionality. We're seeing this with Kamala Harris now in the United States, where this person who for the last 4 years has been effectively hidden from view because she's so embarrassing is suddenly brought out into the limelight. She's still embarrassing, but for some reason, because she isn't Trump and because the people who don't want Trump are delighted that they've got at least somebody to cling on to, they're now pushing her forward, and she will smile and laugh and giggle and generally not be Donald Trump, and that is enough for most people. If by contrast you are always saying or often saying things are bad, your government is lying to you, we're being tricked, they are authoritarian, they are trying to close down free speech, these are very often the messages which certainly I give and which FVD also gives. That doesn't make you popular, actually. And you generally, in politics, you generally don't get rewarded for having been right. Other people jump on the bandwagon when they see that you were right, but they won't necessarily give you credit for it. So I can't predict now what, if any, reaction there will be among the Dutch public or in the European public generally to this latest news. I hope, of course, that people will start to understand that Ukraine is playing a very dirty game, independently of the war. But I'm not particularly optimistic because I've been disappointed too many times by the way that people sort of glide, they snap from one thing to another. And, T.S. Eliot said, humankind cannot bear too much reality. And many political careers have been built on distracting. I live in France. Emmanuel Macron is a perfect example of this, distracting people. Emmanuel Macron has been elated for the last 3 weeks because it's been the Olympic Games and it's been, fantasy and the ceremony and literally Never Never Land. And that's the region, that sort of virtual region of make-believe is where most political careers, unfortunately, are made these days.
Yeah, it sounds like beyond the distraction of perhaps pop culture, the Olympics, and other types of media, people might just be pretty apathetic because you can look at some of the low election turnouts in different European elections. You can also see exactly what you described with not having referenda in many countries where that type of direct representation is not even allowed. You may occasionally see it, but it's more of a collaboration as opposed to the rule. So I think that might also be one of the issues. So my next question is, you talked about being a Eurosceptic yourself. You talked about the party being a Eurosceptic party. So on this channel, we've talked with a number of thinkers who suggested that the European Union, the very founding of the European Union, depended on American institutions coming out of the Marshall Plan. So we're going back to the late 1940s. We can look at other institutions, right, like the European Coal and Steel Community in the 50s. So all of those little steps along the way prior to establishing this sort of supernatural state depended on having American institutions. So is it then... does it make sense for the Forum for Democracy to look for representation in the European Parliament? Is it about sort of fighting the system from within the system? How do you articulate this particular question? It's obviously very difficult.
Yeah, so on the issue of the history, as it happens, I'm a university lecturer and I give lectures on exactly this. So I'm very well... I know an awful lot about the American origins of the European communities. You mentioned the coal and steel community that grew directly out of a structure which the Americans belonged to, in fact, from 1947 onwards. And then when they decided to create to make it more European, and as you absolutely rightly mentioned, the Marshall Plan, the Marshall Plan was itself gave rise to the Organization for European Economic Cooperation, which is now called the OECD, but at the time was an American finance structure to create a single market in Europe. All the origins of the European Union are American, all of them. There's just absolutely no doubt, and I could go on about this subject for hours. So, but that's not your question. Your question is, do we fight the system from within? Well, I'm just an advisor to the party, but the answer is that the FED and Thierry Baudet regard their membership of, so in this case, the Dutch Parliament, and unfortunately, as I say, we don't have a member of the European Parliament, they regard them as platforms. They regard Thierry, I think it's fair to say that he regards being a member of the Dutch Parliament as having a platform. It gives him a public space, it gives him a public presence, and he is able, in virtue of the prestige that gives, to say things and to be noticed which otherwise wouldn't happen. But I don't think that he is under any illusions at all. In fact, he isn't under any illusions. And he gave a lecture in Budapest only a few days ago on this very subject, that politics can change anything. On the contrary, when the COVID thing happened, he could see, and of course the same is true of almost every other issue, whether it's Ukraine or Europe or NATO or whatever, that the members of the government, never mind just the members of parliament, members of government never question anything. They never think about anything. They literally don't even, set up committees of inquiry to look into, the scientific benefit or otherwise of lockdowns and all the rest of it. They literally operate as a herd, and that applies, of course, within national governments, but also between national governments. And we saw this in COVID, where they all started to use, and indeed this continues, they use the same slogans. You remember Build Back Better in New Zealand, in London, in Paris, in Berlin, everyone, and in The Hague, everyone was building back better. That was one of the little slogans they had, and this thing happens all the time. So these people are, as Thierry often says, they are in office, but not in power. They're not actually in power. They are just sort of middle managers, usually pretty mediocre. They know, because that's how they're wired, what they need to do, what they need to say. The managerial structure, the anthropological structure that they belong to, in which they prosper, almost operates on autopilot. They know what signals to give off. They know what signals to obey, and they do it spontaneously. I mention all this because there's very often in these discussions a question of who's really controlling. You don't need a central system of control in the world of political correctness. People who buy into political correctness do it because it's in their character. and they navigate according to the magnetic fields of political correctness. They don't need to be rung up and told you must do this or that. They do it themselves. That's how the managerial structure works. So FED's view is that there's no point, that politics itself won't change anything. Instead, what we try to do, and FED International is part of this, is to basically do metapolitics. So, for instance, Thierry and his colleagues have set up a food company, which brings food directly from farmers. Farmers are under great threat in the Netherlands for various crazy reasons associated with the World Economic Forum and other crazy programs. So they've decided to set up a food program, a food delivery service, which brings food directly from farmers to the clients. And this is a way of setting up a parallel independent structure. Thierry has other plans, very, very ambitious plans. They have a publishing house. I've mentioned it already. They obviously have a media presence, particularly on social media and so on. So that's how I would answer you. You can't beat the system from the inside. No. The only way to do it is to create your own structures and your own world, if you like, upstream, and hope that downstream, in who knows when, in a few years, maybe in a decade, that will bear fruit.
Yeah, it's a really great point. Okay, Marcelo, go ahead, then I'll jump in.
This point that you just made was so interesting, and I think it's so important for people to understand what you just said. That I mean, this is one step away from privatizing the state, and this is at the same time extremely important for society to be able to organize like that, and at the same time, I believe it's so dangerous. But it's one thing that I think for years and years and years, because I'm from Rio de Janeiro, I'm from Brazil, and institutions in Brazil barely work, or I would say they work exactly on the thin line between absurd, revolution and poverty. And I always thought like that. People just need to organize themselves and start doing stuff. So this is when I created the channel. This was the idea. Start organizing people. We are creating a very tiny, small community here in Brazil as well, and internationally. Yep. But I would have one question for that. And is this working? At a minimum level, at least. And it's a true curiosity, because I believe in that. And if there is a use case, an experiment ongoing, I want to know if it's giving results. I would not say, is this working? Is it giving results, positive results for the farmers, I would say?
Well, I think probably, it gives some positive results. The food delivery service is a business, so it works, it makes a bit of money, and of course they're hoping to grow. But equally, from the metapolitical point of view, any success is still to come. I mean, the system, I mentioned the way it auto-generates. It generates its own following. That's the whole point about the magnetic fields that I mentioned, that people navigate. People who don't have any convictions, they navigate according to the magnetic fields of what they think they're supposed to do. That's how most people operate. Many people operate that way. Okay, like a flock of birds, they go, they know, as it were, almost instinctively how to go. And then you get the few awkward people like you and me who, stand aside from the herd and so on. But no, it's not. I think the system has a lot of life left in it. And we've seen, I mentioned 2016. 2016 was the year of this Dutch referendum. It was the year of Brexit, and it was the year of Donald Trump's election. They're three big anti-system events. And yet we saw that in 2017, Emmanuel Macron was elected in France. That was the system striking back. Obviously, Trump was only in power for 4 years. The Dutch referendum was simply ignored, and so on. So there's a lot still to do.
It's a really great point about the system, because usually people talk or ask, as you said, about puppet masters, whether it's the World Economic Forum or certain transnational elites. And my background is also in history, not in sociology. But what I do remember from what little I've read in sociology is that once the system is set in place, it replicates itself. And I've always thought about how does this apply to historic events of the 20th century, for instance. So this is how I would view it as well, that it's not necessary to have a particular puppet master telling, the individual chess pieces on the board to do certain things. Also, when it comes to the culture war, I think a lot of it is self-censorship and the question of propriety and the question of social stigma. That is obviously a very smart way, even though it's a very evil way to control people. And this is one of the ways in which the system replicates itself. But I guess my question is now about you. You talked about your connection to Brexit. I think if we Google your name, you come up as one of the intellectual sort of forefathers of Brexit. How do you view this? What did you think about Brexit? Are you actually one of the intellectual forefathers of that, of the exit from the European Union for the UK? Can you please elaborate?
Well, I was called that by a former Labour minister for Europe, so I of course was very flattered when he said that. He said that because I wrote a book in 1997 called "The Undemocratic Origins of the European Idea," and I could see, and I tried to explain how the European Union was an authoritarian project. This was in 1997, it's a long time ago. I didn't play any role at all in the Brexit campaign itself in 2016. I was involved in a much earlier campaign in Britain, indirectly, but I wasn't involved at all in the actual Brexit campaign. But what this Labour minister meant was that I had written a book which a number of people had read at the time, and so on. What do I think about it? Well, I think it's the system has had its revenge. We even in Britain, which of course was relative in a very relative way, was a dissident country within the European Union. The political class in Britain was overwhelmingly in favour of remaining in the European Union. There was a massive majority in the House of Commons which was in favour of remaining, obviously also in the media, in the professions, in the universities, in the judiciary, and so on. So there was a huge centre of gravity in the state and in the deep state, if you like, in favour of remaining. And so when Brexit happened, when the governments that came into power after the referendum were morally obliged to implement it, they did it in a very half-hearted way. In addition to which, as it happens in the case of Britain, Britain has accumulated, I think, over the decades, particularly in the last 2 decades, so for the last 20 years or so, 25 years, a number of structural weaknesses, particularly a very, very severe addiction to immigration. When I say addiction, I mean economic addiction. Britain has absolutely gigantic levels of immigration. We've seen the riots recently in Britain, but there's no doubt that when you have, even under a conservative government which pretended to be against immigration, when you had 1.4 million people coming into the country, as you did in 2023, then you can only conclude that this was desired, or at least was not undesired, because even any government can introduce measures which reduce those levels of immigration, and the reason why they didn't do it, in my opinion, is that they felt wrongly, in my view, that large sections of the economy would suffer if there wasn't this constant arrival of cheap labour. So there are many long-term structural weaknesses in Britain, and not just in Britain, but certainly also in Britain. And those, I think, also go some way to explaining the fact that Brexit has been a damp squib. It's been a non-event. A non-event for Britain. It's not a non-event for the European Union, because obviously it's a colossal loss for the European Union. Britain was the second largest contributor to the European budget. It has had the strongest army. London is the financial centre of the world actually, but also obviously of Europe. So it was a very major loss. The Europeans, of course, don't see it that way, or at least they pretend not to see it that way. But objectively, if the Soviet Union was said to have begun to collapse when the Baltic states left, well, the Baltic states is nothing. It's peanuts. Whereas the United Kingdom leaving is obviously a major loss for the imperial structure in Brussels.
Then the other difficult question is, on the one hand, there is this massive loss that was dealt to the EU, but at the same time, you keep mentioning the EU system striking back. So I know it's very difficult to make forecasts in this way. Is it possible for Europe to survive outside of the European Union? Is it possible for Europe to be sovereign outside of the European Union? Is it possible to exist outside of the European Union?
No, because the European Union, I mean, we talked a moment ago about the origins back in the late 40s and 50s. The American control, to put it that way, over Europe, and we talked about Nord Stream a few minutes earlier, has only increased. Far from becoming sovereign, the European Union has become less sovereign. When it voted its last treaty, the Treaty of Lisbon, in 2009, which is the current treaty that is in force, it agreed in that treaty collectively that its foreign policy would not diverge from that of NATO. That's in the constitutional treaty. It's now called the Treaty on European Union. It's one of the treaty obligations of the European Union that its foreign and security policy may not diverge from NATO. There's no obligation on NATO's side not to diverge from the policy of the European Union. So it's a one-way obligation. And that means that the European Union, by its own texts, is legally obliged to follow NATO, which means, of course, following the Americans. And in the last 2 years, we've only seen that in absolute, in the most stark way possible, with this extraordinary situation. And again, you referred to that indirectly, Nina, earlier. Many people say, and I think they're right, that the Americans they probably know that they can't win. They can't win in Ukraine. They can't win. They can't beat Russia. They think probably they can wage a war of attrition and weaken Russia. I don't think they can, but that's probably what they think. But ultimately, they think, well, okay, so what? We can't win in Russia. We're not going to expel Russia from the Donbass or Crimea or whatever. But what we can do, at least, is ruin the European economy. And the European economy is a competitor. And if at least we get that out of this war, then we will have taken out a major competitor. Both by obviously dividing the European continent, by dividing Germany and Russia, which has been a historic aim of the Americans, as explained famously on, everyone probably has seen this guy called George Friedman, a strategist in America, who's explained this very clearly. Brzezinski explains it. They not only by dividing obviously Germany and Russia, which are the two largest countries by far in Europe, but also, of course, by deindustrializing Europe through energy prices. Energy prices are now far higher in Europe than they are in Asia or in America. And many companies, including the giant German industrial giants like BASF, are closing their plants in Europe, including hugely important sectors like fertilizer and chemicals and so on, and relocating them to the United States of America, where energy is about 30% of what it costs in Europe, or of course to Asia.
Right. That was, I think, one of the most shocking consequences of the escalation of the war in Ukraine, because we usually say that it actually started in 2014 and 2022 was just an escalation. It wasn't the beginning with the overthrow of government and the war in Donbass. But when you read the news and you see that in certain parts of Europe, people are returning to using coal, and at the same time, they're trying to push for these green policies, which, even on the surface, is a huge disconnect between what they're advocating and what they're actually doing. It's really shocking. So do you think there is a way for Europe to have its own defense system outside of NATO? Is the only way to sort of have a controlled collapse of the European Union, perhaps maybe not as, everyone exits at the same time, but certain countries like the UK would exit and then someone else will?
I don't think we're going to see that in the short or medium term. There are very big tensions within the European Union. Hungary is the most obvious example. Other tensions, East-West tensions on sort of societal issues like LGBT and so on. To a certain extent, tensions between France and Germany. So the atmosphere is not particularly good. But I'm afraid the system has a huge amount of institutional inertia. There are, for example, in most European countries, no or very few Eurosceptic politicians. I've mentioned FVD in the Netherlands, but it's a small party, 3 members of parliament out of 150. The overwhelming bulk of the political class in these countries buys into the European project, buys into the Atlantic project. And that includes, if I take the Netherlands as an example, new ministers who've just taken office who are young men and young women. They're in their 30s. They're looking forward to a whole career in this system. So I can't predict that it's for tomorrow. Of course, there are signs of the collapse of American leadership. The whole senility of Joe Biden, the unbelievable incoherence, strategic incoherence of trying to fight 2 wars at the same time, one against Russia and one against China. Even the Americans don't have the capacity for that. The rather pathetic attempt to continue to pretend that the world is as it used to be, when in fact Russia, China, India, as we know, Brazil, South Africa, Brazil and South Africa are less important, but Russia, China, and India coming together as they have done in recent years, and even more so since 2022. These are gigantic developments, and I briefly mentioned Brzezinski. Brzezinski's famous book, The Grand Chessboard from 1996, he explains how the Americans control Eurasia. And he says, this is how we do it. We have our strategic points on the periphery of the world island. He uses this Mackinderish vocabulary. So Western Europe is a point of support, then the Middle East with Saudi Arabia and so on, and then obviously in the Far East, Korea and Japan and things like that. So he explains this all in very geopolitical terms, and he says in his book, he says if the major powers of Eurasia should ever get together and come together in reaction against this hegemonic project of ours, then it would be over. And of course, that's exactly what has now happened, because particularly Russia and China have developed over the last 10 or 15 years unbelievably deep economic, political, military, and of course energy cooperation. And political cooperation at the international level. When you read Putin was in Peking just after Xi Jinping's re-election a couple of months ago. Xi Jinping had come to Moscow the previous year just after Putin's re-election. When you read the communiques of these two colossal countries, and when you see how India as well, the world's largest democracy, and indeed the most populous country on the planet, when you see how these countries are coming together, then if you know your Brzezinski and if you understand the American project, then you can only conclude that it's coming to an end.
unless my memory escapes me, I think Brzezinski also mentions Iran in that context, so Russia, China, and Iran as being the three sort of, the three important.
I didn't want to go on for too long, but he absolutely said if they were to be joined by Iran, then it would really be game over.
Which is exactly what American politics in the Middle East have created. They sort of pushed these countries together that may not have been as close as they are now if it weren't in response to American foreign policy, which is remarkable because that makes you wonder whether they really recognize the types of international relationships they have created, precisely the ones that they wanted to avoid. So yeah, that's a very important point. And it seems like with all these recent visits to China of European leaders and Chinese leaders coming to Europe, there probably is a little bit of that recognition of the realities on the ground, obviously the Chinese Belt and Road, et cetera, et cetera. So I mean, maybe reality will come knocking in some shape or form that is constructive rather than destructive in this sense. But I'd like to go back to the fascinating point that you made about essentially establishing a parallel society. So when you talked about delivering food directly from the farmers, in North America, we have farmers markets in the summer. It's kind of like a little miniature version of that as well, right? We go and we buy food that is actually not poisoned by pesticides, and we give money directly to the farmers. So I think it's something that does exist in other places as well. But I wanted to know, where does academia, ideas in intellectualism function in the way that you're talking about establishing this sort of miniature parallel society? You're obviously there are certain examples of people like you in the academia that teach things according to reality as opposed to what the system might want. But is there a way to do something more coherent, to establish some kind of an institution, where a legitimate institution where ideas would be discussed, maybe beyond a think tank, where newer generations would be educated, much like you're working with the youth wing of the party?
Well, I mean, I'm lucky enough to teach in a small university where I can, as you very well put it, teach reality. I'm very lucky to have that. And okay, it's very small. It's in the French provinces. It has a relatively limited reach. But yes, I mean, again, FED does that. We have a think tank. We continue to have a think tank in Amsterdam. Which holds weekly lectures. The FED has also set up a school, and that is, of course, I mean, it's very small. It's just a primary school for the time being, but Dutch law allows them to do it, and they've done it. So, obviously it's a small step, but yes, ultimately, one would hope to go on and have secondary schools and then universities and so on. Absolutely. I mean, do
you think there might be a systemic crackdown on institutions like that, on nascent institutions, that, there would be a realization that they're sort of challenging the types of things that are coming from within the dominant narratives, from within the system itself?
Yes, there might well be. I mean, I've just... there's just been a horrible incident in Germany where quite a big magazine was closed down on the orders of the government. I happen to know the editor quite well, and so I followed that case very closely. Luckily, yesterday, the Federal Administrative Court in Germany annulled and suspended the closure. So there has been a small victory. Well, actually quite a big victory. So yes, I think that it's absolutely possible that the state will try to use its force. We've seen this in Britain. We've seen it in many other countries where either media outlets or associations are closed down. So yes, the state is prepared to go a long way, but one keeps on trying, and the university where I teach is not a party school. It's not a training college for conservative politicians. It's a real university. It awards real degrees. It has its own reputation. It has academic standards. It does research and so on. So these institutions can exist. It's true they're very rare in Europe. They're very, very rare. There are more of them in the United States than in Europe. But we have to hope that by doing good, by trying to do good, by trying to do what we can, that one way or the other, the truth will prevail.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And if our viewers were paying attention last week, we did, our guest from Austria did mention this German magazine. So it's interesting that there's been an update, which seems a little bit like a unicorn legal victory these days. But let's jump to kind of a more abstract concept. Obviously, the party contains the word democracy. It's a word that has had different meanings. If we go back to Athens, as everyone knows, that particular type of democracy was in a state that had slavery. What is meant by democracy today, especially when these transatlantic elites talk about our democracy, seems very vague. It's whatever fits into that concept is being presented as our values versus, their values, very much like us and them, friend and enemy distinction. So what meaning do you specifically put into the word democracy when you think about this party? Is it this popular representation like referenda? Is it something else? What is meant by that for a term that's really kind of been damaged, I would say, these days?
Yes, I totally agree that it's been damaged. It's, of course, massively abused, as you say, particularly by the American state, by the American deep state, and I totally agree with that. No, I think what I would understand by democracy would indeed be a much more frequent recourse to referenda, a disbanding of the political class. And I mean, when I say disbanding, that means, yes, dissociating oneself from international organizations, because international organizations are by definition undemocratic. They are systemically undemocratic because they are beyond the reach of electorates. The European Union is beyond the reach of electorates. The European Commission is not elected. The European Commission is only very indirectly held to account through the European Parliament, which itself is not really a parliament and not really a democratic organization. So that it's very important to dislocate or to dissociate oneself from international organizations. It's extremely important to dissolve what in British English we call quangos, quasi-autonomous non-governmental organizations. Liz Truss, the unfortunate British Prime Minister who was in office for only 45 days, said rather bitterly after she was thrown out of 10 Downing Street, she said, "You can't get rid of the Governor of the Bank of England, but you can get rid of the Prime Minister. So who is more powerful?" And although I had no admiration for her at all, that little phrase did actually sum up the problem. British policy, and this is true of all European countries, is totally hedged around, yes, by the European Union, but also by national structures, committees, what's it called? The Committee on Budgetary Responsibility, the Bank of England, Central Bank, all these organizations. There are selection committees for Parliament, for parliamentary candidates. Everything is under control. And so it's very important to dissolve that. And one way of doing it is, yes, to reintroduce referenda and to have as much recourse as possible to popular consultations. We're a very, very long way from that, unfortunately. Switzerland, of course, practices it, but even Switzerland is not immune from the virus. So as a practical step, that's what I would advocate. But unfortunately, we're a long way from it because, of course, the obese state is a fact now in all European countries. The states are more and more deeply into debt. The size of the state grows ever greater with more and more officials and so on. So none of this can happen until those things are thrown into reverse. And it's difficult to see how they will be because, once again, the system is very resilient. Lots of people's livelihoods depend on it. And, turkeys don't vote for Christmas.
That's a really good analogy. So What is the focal point for the international branch of the Forum for Democracy? You just mentioned that you do have activists from the Netherlands coming to work with you. Are you working with multiple European countries? Are you working with Canada and the US? What are the parameters and the focus of this kind of work?
We obviously have partner parties in other parts of Europe, in Hungary, in Bulgaria, in Slovakia, in Germany, in France. We belong to a pan-European party. It's actually being set up at the moment as I speak. But I also run a bit like what you're doing now. I run I've been running it. It's been going now for more than a year. A weekly X space, but we went video for the first time yesterday.
Congratulations!
It's called The Forum. And it was a great success yesterday. I was very, very happy. We talked about Compact Magazine in Germany. Of course, we hope that by doing that, by having the various structures in place. I mentioned the publishing house, the Renaissance Institute in Amsterdam, the school in the Netherlands. By having these, and of course by having our international network, we would like, to become one of the nodal points of whatever you call it, of the search for truth, the resistance, the fight for justice. I'm not quite sure what label to use. Perhaps the search for truth is the best one.
Well, and my last question, thank you for explaining that. So if any of the viewers want to get involved, we linked your website to the stream. So you're welcome to visit John's Twitter account for more information, of course, to see these streams on X, but also go to the website for more information. But my last question, you said that this institute is called Renaissance. Is it meant to be the rebirth of Europe outside of the EU, the rebirth of nation states? Are nation states outdated? What does that, there's clearly a meaning behind this moniker.
Yes, no, nation states are not outdated, absolutely not. But yes, it's the rebirth of Europe beyond this terrible straitjacket in which Europe has built for itself, but which was ultimately built by the Americans, and which is the very long-lasting legacy of the end of the Second World War, which left, as we know, the Americans essentially in control of Western Europe. And it's a long story, and I'm trying to make it short, but we are now in a situation where nation states are derided, and they are put down, and the people are treated with contempt. Again, we've seen this recently in Britain with the horrific brutality with which the new British government has reacted to popular anger at a particularly horrible murder, which I expect your viewers know about. The attitude of the elites is that the people are dangerous. And, this attitude was well caricatured by Bertolt Brecht in 1953, after there were workers' protests in East Germany, in East Berlin. He said, we will have to dissolve the people and elect a new one. And that is the attitude of the political class in Europe. They despise the people. They despise their own people. Keir Starmer was asked whether he preferred Westminster or Davos, and he responded Davos without hesitating, because in his view Westminster is provincial, whereas Davos is international, and you can get things done in Davos and all the rest of it. So we have people who don't like their own countries. Emmanuel Macron does not like France. He despises France. He's often rude about France. He's often rude about the French. He says they're difficult and lazy and all the rest of it. We see this all over the place. And no, nation states are the natural framework for politics, because nation states are a people. It's the same thing, and so they're the natural. You mentioned Athens and so on, but that's what Athens was. Ancient Athens was a people. They were citizens of a particular city, but they were a people who recognized themselves as such, and of course saw themselves as different from the Spartans and so on. And it's exactly the same, albeit on a bigger scale, with the nation states of Europe, which are a fact. They are a historical fact, a biological fact, a linguistic fact, a geographical fact. And the sooner we get back to them being the primary vectors of political life, the better. And the sooner we, as I say, dissociate ourselves from these suffocating both international and national structures which prevent the nation from living and breathing as it should, it's an organism, the better.
Thank you. Yeah, apologies for interrupting. I was going to say that impact of that contempt for the people and their own countries, you can even see it in the so-called Russian liberals who orient themselves towards the West, and they call themselves dissidents. They openly would call the Russians as a biomass in the media, which is, you know, kind of a shocking comment to use about the people that you claim to want to elect you at some point. And it seems to have translated from Europe to these people who operate outside of, you know, in a different country as well. Thank you so much for being here. But I wanted to know if Marcelo had any final parting questions or parting thought, because it's mostly been me asking questions.
I think this final answer was fantastic for finishing. The only thing, just today I have tweeted something that you just mentioned here now, and I think that it's highly important for people to understand. And I would ask you kindly for a quick development on this, which is the you know, people today are so have always been so connected to the words left, right, you know, progressists, whatever, that they completely forgot what the meaning of this is, of all this is. And you use the exact word that I used as a suggestion, which is, you know, revolution or resistance, whatever, of the system. I would like to understand how people, and I'm asking more for other people than for myself, how people could understand that they are on the right path, not just following a horde that self-proclaims as being leftist or rightist or whatever, you know, and really join a revolution, a resistance against the system, a rage against the machine.
Well, I don't have an easy answer. I mean, that's Nina's earlier questions, you know, also were sort of probing that, you know, the what is to be done, the eternal question, what is to be done. I think that culture is important. We haven't mentioned that except indirectly when we talked a moment ago about education. But culture is important, and if people's cultural level goes down, that's not a good thing, and of course it is going down. I mean, I personally think that politics, if it is influential, and I'm skeptical about its ability to influence things, can be influential when it is optimistic and positive. And the difficulty, of course, in our present predicament is being optimistic, because obviously things are pretty dire. But I suppose that we can just carry on saying the truth and telling the truth as we see it, and trying to hope that with fora like this, that the truth will eventually get through to people, and the truth will set us free.
Sticking to reality, although some people would debate what reality is. John, thank you so much for being here. This was really helpful, again, for those who would like to learn more about the party's work and John's work specifically. We've linked his Twitter account. We've linked the website. Do you have any sort of updates on what you're working on beyond working with these activists from the Netherlands that you'd like to mention before?
Well, no, I think we've more or less said everything. Yeah,
sure.
It's very kind of you to have me on your show. I really appreciate it.
Well, perhaps we can have you back one of these days where you can give us a more expanded lecture on these institutions that we talked about from 1947, 48 up until today, since you're an expert on this topic, and it's one of my favorite subjects. So I think we'll have a lot to talk about as sort of history goes, but also I think it'll be very interesting for the viewers to learn things that they perhaps may not know about. Thank you so much, John.
Okay, thank you so much, Dean. And thank you, Marcelo. All the best.
Thank you so much, John. Goodbye. And everybody, remember to like, share, subscribe. I have to do that. I'm sorry. And all the links for John and Nina are on the description in the Press of Mass Destruction. All the links for John and me are on Nina's channel. And you can find all the links for John's work on his social media that are linked on the description. So thank you very much. Thank you all for coming and joining us today, and see you next time. See you, Nina. See you, John.
See you guys. Thank you.
Bye.